Hi, folks, back again talking about marriage and family. This week, we'll be talking about race and ethnicity within the social history of marriage and family in the United States. To sort of recap from last week we focused a lot on the unique diversity of family social history in our country, and within that, how much inequality is tied to the study of family. And really, that's because social inequality, particularly in terms of class and race and gender, is a fundamental part of social life in American society. And so, in talking about race, we're going to be expanding on that. In talking about ethnicity, we're going to be expanding on those, in a sense, themes that came with what we did in the second chapter. For this chapter, we have some additional themes. The first of which we need to talk about what and who a minority is, or a subordinate or subordinated group or persons are in our society or any given society. When we're talking about a minority, we're talking about a group that's not necessarily smaller numerically. We're talking about a group in terms of its power and in terms of its privilege and the positionality of influence. We're looking at it being smaller in how much power the members individually and collectively of the group actually have. And so that's ultimately what makes women a minority group in our society, even though women outnumber men. We're looking at women having significantly less power, wealth, and privilege than men, and structures and institutions in society that then and now have restricted access to power and privilege for women. We're also talking about African Americans, Latinos or Latinx persons, Asian Americans and Native Americans, and those individuals who consider themselves multiracial or multicultural. Again, with groups of color or people of color, we're talking about ultimately, we're looking again at a power minority circumstance, where again, having less access to power, resources, wealth, privilege, less presence at the top in leadership positions across major institutions in society, that ultimately is what relegates and renders groups having minority status having been attached to that label. And so minority groups are subordinated groups. That is, they have less power, less privilege, less advantage, and often less prestige within society and less respect. And we'll talk about how these processes in society have unfolded over years. Also, of course, we have to talk about the majority group or the dominant group within society. And so, with respect to the majority or the dominant group, we're talking about whites, we're talking about white folks, and we're talking about, again, institutions that largely reflected and shaped their viewpoints, assumptions, and their worldview as to be seen as the norm. And so all societies are designed to produce conformity of one kind or another, and all societies have a range of dominant groups. In our society, men among white folks are examples of dominant groups and aggregates in our society. And so again, they don't necessarily have to be larger in number. Again, we have more women in our society than we do men, but when it comes to how we distribute societal rewards and societal resources, overwhelmingly, societal rewards and resources are tied to men and tied to and controlled by and dominated by white men. And so that's ultimately what we mean by the majority group, or ultimately the dominant group in society. And that's how you can understand and come to understand a concept like white privilege, which is a way of describing the unearned advantages that white folks have over folks and people of color. And again, so with that, we're looking at white folks not having ever had to face a subordinated status where their physicality, their race, has been perceived as a marker for derision or for lower status and mistreatment. And so, again, white Europeans, when the colonialists in particular, but also as white Europeans immigrated to this country, they did not have the same experience of repression, of wealth or power or privilege that we saw overwhelmingly tied to and attached to the experiences of groups of color. At the same time, and especially if you study race and ethnic relations, indeed, constituent white ethnic groups did go through and suffer from discrimination of various sorts, including the Irish and Italian Americans as well. But nevertheless, over time, those groups became white, or they were perceived as white. And so, in so doing, they did not have the same limits to their ability to develop and produce capital, start businesses, establish neighborhoods, and to move freely and live freely about the country. And so we'll talk more about that as well when we get into how racial categories were ultimately maintained. All right. Also, another theme that we have to talk about simply is wealth inequality. And so, what we're talking about with wealth is we're looking at and talking about assets. And so, wealth really involves your assets minus your debts. It's what you own minus what you owe. And overwhelmingly, white folks have incredible, vast amounts of wealth beyond that which people of color have. And so, if we look, for instance, at the most recent data from the Pew Center, we're looking at white folks typically having close to 20 times the wealth of African Americans and close to 18 times the wealth of Latinos or Latinx persons. And so, again, we're looking at the ability within white folks, within white communities and white families. By legal standards, legally, whites were able to pass down wealth and have wealth be bequeathed from one generation to another. African Americans, Latinos, Native Americans, and Asian Americans largely have not been able to do those things from a very long point in time. And so, generally speaking, people of color in our society are newer to wealth and newer to the experience of wealth creation and wealth generation. Even though there are going to be different levels of wealth if we compare, let's say, Latinx or Latino persons, if we compare Latinos or Latinx persons to Asian Americans, to African Americans, to Native Americans, each group of color has a unique wealth experience, but nevertheless, dramatically less wealth, if you will, over time and in present with respect to how they compare to white folks. Also, another thing we have to talk about is deindustrialization. And so we've talked about that before, and really that's a fancy way of saying that our country's economy has shifted from manufacturing to services. We don't have as much heavy industry, hence the term deindustrialization. And so that factors heavily in the experience, particularly of wealth, power, and privilege, and the difficulties to access that and maintain that for people of color. Overwhelmingly, deindustrialization did hurt communities of color a lot more. Semi-skilled and unskilled labor were jobs and labor efforts more common to African Americans and Latinos. And often that brought African Americans and Latinos from the South to the Midwest and to the Northeast to work in the auto industry or other kinds of manufacturing endeavors, particularly before the 1960s. And so we're talking about jobs that did not really require much beyond often a junior high education or a high school diploma. And so in a lot of respects, what happened is these jobs were a gravitational pull. They were pull factors to get people to migrate from one part of the country to another, for instance, from the Southwest or the South to the Midwest or the Northeast for the good manufacturing jobs that you could find in Michigan, that you could find in Wisconsin, Ohio, Pennsylvania, and Illinois, just to name a few. And so these jobs paid well. They didn't require much education or much in the way of high skill acquisition. And so they could pay enough, and often did throughout through the 60s, up into and through the 60s. A lot of these jobs did pay well enough to support a family and provided a good standard of living. So they were sort of this combination of high wage, low skilled job. And so also too, of course, we saw a lot of white males also be employed in the same positions and capacities as well. So especially as the 60s and the 70s approach and develop and pass, you just don't see as much heavy industry jobs like that for a few reasons. A lot of those jobs did move overseas. Some moved to the South or the southern part of the country. And if they moved to that part of the country, they tended not to be the same amount of jobs that you saw in the North from plant to plant or factory to factory. Another thing that affected that process also was In a lot of respects, you had more robotics, you had more technology developing that, in a sense and directly, did not require as many workers. And so that's a big part of what happened, especially starting in the 60s with this deindustrialization process. We just had more machine technologies that were developing, and we had companies and corporations like the automakers and the auto industry that really wanted to lessen the burden of organized labor in terms of labor costs. And one of the best ways to do that was to move factories and plants to the south or to move them overseas, or increasingly what we see today is that a lot of this work is completely just untied. It's removed from human hands and human capacity because a lot of it is done now by machines and robots and other kinds of technological innovations. So that process hurt people of color a lot more because they were much more likely to work in physical labor, what we sometimes call neck down jobs that were industrial in nature, that brought African Americans to Cleveland, to Detroit, Flint, Chicago, Philadelphia, and so forth all around the country. And so this pattern plays heavily with respect to what we see now, even though it took place 60 some years ago. Also, if we're talking about race and ethnicity in our society, we also have to realize it's closely tied to urbanization. Urbanization is the increasing concentration of people in cities. And I had mentioned to you before that largely the United States is an urban society. The vast majority of U.S. citizens live in a major or a regional metropolitan area. So most of us live in or around cities like Flint or Saginaw or Los Angeles or Philadelphia or Houston or Atlanta or Charlotte. We live either in that city or we live in a suburban area that's, say, for instance, within an hour of the city core itself. And so that's generally what we've been doing over the past several decades, is we've been moving in a sense closer into more urbanized locations, and that happens for a variety of reasons. It's harder for most people to live a rural life. You really just can't easily live in a rural community for the most part as you can in an urban one. There are just more services available, there's more convenience, and there are more jobs available and social networks that can easily be exploited for a good purpose. And so those kinds of things also galvanize people to live in and around cities. Particularly if we look at populations of persons of color, Asian Americans, African Americans, Latinos, and to some extent Native Americans, they are more likely to live in and around cities because, again, that's where job opportunities were often available that would permit families of color to support themselves more than in a prior region, let's say, for instance, the South or the Southwest. And so the Great Migration of African Americans north was a way to claim higher wages. And this was something that Henry Ford tapped into with Ford Motor Company. He beckoned and called for African Americans to move from the South to Metro Detroit, to move to communities like Inkster and Romulus, where, again, you had Ford plants that were rapidly developing. And he declared, hey, I'll pay a prevailing wage, and you won't have to face discrimination like you ordinarily would face in the South. And so, again, ultimately, urbanization becomes an explanatory variable for this kind of movement. We also cannot leave out, when we're talking about race and ethnicity in our society, we cannot leave out ideology, ultimately racist ideologies. Really from the very beginning of this nation as a republic, if we look at colonization history, if we look at the colonization of the United States and we look at how that took place, if we look at the shift from indentured servitude to slavery and the slave system as a system of institutions and a culture in our society, if we look at the treatment of groups of color as they arrived in waves one after another, ideologies that ultimately said that people of color were inferior, that they were inhuman, that they were debased, were developed, grown, and codified, legally put into the boilerplate language of the function of the government itself. If we look at the culture, if we look at postcards, art, figurines, a lot of these were made into racist caricatures, rather, as the country that we know of today as the United States grew and developed. And so, as this country grew and developed with these ideas of the land of the free and democracy and certain inalienable rights, those were not granted or regarded to people of color. And so we had that duality of, well, we are this free society where life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness are granted, but they were only granted to white men. And they were only granted to white people in general. And so people of color were dehumanized, not seen as human. In that process of dehumanization, that was seen as a justification for them not being granted those rights. And so those ideologies we are still battling today, especially if we look at the Black Lives Matter movement, if we look at civil unrest happening in our cities, especially happening, has been happening presently, but throughout this year amid the pandemic, what some people are terming this period, they're terming it sort of the second civil rights movement. And in a lot of respects, a lot of what we're dealing with now is because of so much of what has truly been unfinished with respect to civil rights in our nation's history that have long since been established with respect to various equality movements of people of color, of women, of gays and lesbians, bisexual and transgendered folks, and so forth. And so a lot of that is a big part of our history. And again, ultimately American history is tied to and is rooted in social inequality. And so, again, that's why we have to explore these themes, particularly of ideology. All right, some terms. We have to talk about some terminology, some ways within which to sort of think about the topic of race, ethnicity, and immigration. We have the terms here to be constructs, to be ways within which we can think about how do we talk about this? How do we talk about it in a way that does not promote injury of the very groups that are of subordinated status? As they have been subordinated throughout much of American history into the present, that doesn't obviously mean that that's the way it's supposed to be. Again, think about the equality movements. Think about what's been happening in 2020 with the civil unrest that we've seen in cities, with the protests over the deaths of Breonna Taylor and George Floyd, just to name a couple of a myriad of people of color, black people in particular, who've been hurt, killed, and maimed and persecuted in the name of public safety. And so all of this stuff that's been happening now, but also, if you will, from the past into the present, to talk about it, we have to have the best terminology available. And so you may think, as I mention these things, you might think, well, we used to say this about that, or we used to call this that. That's okay, in that as groups position themselves to gain more power, more influence, to reject the minority status that they have, and to ultimately enable the quest for mainstream social acceptance, the terminology has to change. It has to change to reflect new understandings, new assumptions, and ways within which the group wants to ultimately define itself and demand and command respect. And so that's a lot of what the terms are about. The first of which we'll talk about is sort of the term or the phrase people of color. Sometimes it's even shortened or abbreviated to POC, people of color. This is a inclusive umbrella term referring to Native Americans, African Americans, Latinos or Latinx persons, as well as Asian Americans and multiracial or multicultural folks. So in the past, often these groups were referred to as colored people, quote unquote, and we all have color. White folks have color, African American folks have color, Latinx folks have color, Asian Americans have color, Native Americans have color. We all have color. So often, too, in the past, to say someone was colored was a derogatory term. It was sort of a nicer slur than using the N-word or something of that sort. So, and then of course, not only are you slurring someone by saying a colored person, you're again still dehumanizing that person within the slur. And so people of color reverses that. It's a way to sort of reclaim the humanity and identity and the dignity of the groups and the constituent individuals of color. And so again, you'll want to use that people of color as an affirmation of African Americans, Latinx persons, Native Americans, and Asian Americans, and multicultural persons. And so this is a better way to talk about groups of color. On occasion, I will use Latinx as well as Latino. And Latino, Latinx are terms and terminologies that refer to persons who have Mexican, Puerto Rican, Cuban, Dominican, Central or South American, or other Spanish cultural origin. And so that's what we're talking about. Latinos. Latinx is a way of referring to Latinos that is gender neutral, that doesn't gender who or what it means to be Latino. And so if you think of, for instance, the Spanish culture, if you think of Spanish culture and Latino language, often the world is gendered in terms of O and A. And so the X has been a more recent development to sort of rein that in, to say, you know what, gender matters, but it's also important to be gender neutral and to not automatically assign terms of power to men or to masculinity, and to deny women those kinds of power recognitions as well. And so that's really what Latinx gets to. And so it's one of those terms that's sort of out now, but people debate, well, does it really make sense? Should you have it? Should you say it? Should you not? So I'm just letting you know I'll be using that with Latino back and forth, so to speak. Also, African American. So especially during the 80s into the 90s, there was a movement or a shift from only using black to describe black people or African American people to using black and or African American interchangeably, kind of like Latino and Latinx. And so again, the idea was, in saying African American, we are saying that these are individuals who are of African descent, whose ancestors were brought to America through the slave trade. And so that's a way of sort of delineating the unique ethnic experience that African Americans have that ultimately developed as them being a racial minority and a oppressed minority group within society. So in my notes and in my discussions, I typically use black or African American interchangeably. That both in my use and in my view matter, but at the same time some people prefer one more than the other, right? So those are ways within which we can think about terminology. And again, there are other terms and there are other ways to sort of, with terminology, conceptualize the different unique constituent groups of color. And so again, depending on the subject, you may see them come up. For instance, if we're talking about Mexican Americans, if we're talking about Latin American studies or Latino or Latinx studies, you may hear about Chicano or Chicana studies, ways within which Mexican Americans and Mexican American culture have been in our study. And so those are great ways to sort of think about this. And if you're interested in the future, especially to learn more about these groups, then you definitely would want to take a few additional courses within sociology as well as within history or ethnic studies. For instance, you can take classes in sociology such as race and ethnic relations. It's a great course to talk about a lot of these concerns and circumstances for people and groups of color. Also, you can take courses in Latino studies or Latinx studies, Asian American studies, as well as African American studies, especially when or if you transfer from Mott to a four-year institution. All right, so we need to talk about ultimately what a race is, and we need to talk about what ethnicity is as well. I just had to take a quick swig of water. Sorry about that. Now, when we're talking about race, keep in mind that a race is a group whose members, I should say, it's a group whose members share some socially defined biological features that set them apart from other groups. So keep in mind that race is a social construction. So race and categories of race really grow and grew out of social definitions, social conditions. So these categories and groupings did not come out of biological concerns or biological considerations. In fact, as a science, biology this really, as a science, biology developed sort of after racial categories and groups were created. And so again, if you think about germ theory, if you think about immunization, nutrition, a lot of what we know about that, especially within the natural science realm, a lot of that was really dawning and developing during the mid to late 1800s, much like what we saw with the social sciences. But again, the use of race and racial categories really predates a lot of what we see in terms of the true scientific method developing and turning into disciplines, especially after the Industrial Revolution of the mid 1700s. Also, research has shown in a number of ways that there's more genetic variation. If we're looking truly at this as a biological issue, there's more genetic variation, if you will, within a racial group than between racial groups. And so if we're looking within Latinx persons, if we're looking in or within Asian American communities and persons, we'll find more variation within the Asian American racial group than we'll find between whites and Asians. And so again, this just gets you to think about how social this is, and this is ultimately a social construction. We could create entirely new races today. We could say that it's about how long or short your arms are. We could say it's about the length or the texture of your hair alone, and then we could create new categories based upon that. And we, in so doing, if we deem those socially significant and we empower some people for having arms of certain lengths and those who have arms of another length, we disempower. Again, that's what ultimately creates the racial classification and the racial categorizations that we see. We're all Homo sapiens, we're all humans, and again, what we've done is we've taken something that is truly superficial and we've overlaid it with social meanings and we've reified it. That is to say, we've made it larger than life, and so that's ultimately what race gives us. Not to mention, keep in mind that race varies. It changes from time to time and from place to place. Some of you or your family members could get on a plane. You could fly for several hours and go to a completely different country. Let's say, for instance, in Latin America, let's say in South America, you could, in flying to that country, to Brazil perhaps, or to Peru, in going to that other country, your race and how you're classified racially or how your family members are classified racially could change, ultimately based on how those countries define and classify race. So here in the United States, we've typically classified people according to their ancestry and how much of a certain ancestry they have. And in that process, just the construction of and the defining of each race is racist in and of itself, because again, racist ideology is what ultimately created and sustained these racial groups. So it's possible for someone to be considered black, for instance, or African American here in the States, but perhaps if they flew somewhere else, they can be considered in a completely different racial group or category because of how that country categorizes and classifies people according to race. Now, when we talk about ethnicity or ethnic group, we're talking about a group whose members have a shared cultural heritage. And so an ethnic group or an ethnicity, the members of the group have the same culture. They have the same cultural link, the same cultural lineage and heritage. And it's often based upon the nation that they're from. So if we're thinking about Polish Americans, if we're thinking about Mexican Americans, we're looking at an ethnic cultural identity. And this is also true too for African Americans who came from a range of tribes and a range of different countries and cultures, largely in West Africa and the Caribbean. Of course, slavery denied them direct practice and continued links to their heritage, but nevertheless, the creation of blackness and of African American identity, ultimately, how that was superimposed upon by the racial ideology of our country, ultimately created and sustained an ethnic or a cultural identity for African Americans as well. All right. Now we have to also talk about how racial categories were not only developed, but we have to also look at how they were maintained. And so there are a number of systems in our society that have been employed significantly over time that ultimately are a testament to how racial classifications were able to persist from one generation to the next. First, of course, starting with slavery. And so African Americans and selectively members of other groups as well were reduced to being property and the extensions of the whims of white slaveholders and politicians who denied them basic human rights and dignity for well over 250 years. These efforts ensured that all institutions, including the family, were dominated by whites and restricted non-whites from access. Right? Going on, Jim Crow segregation continued this process of legal segregation. And so a lot of this happened after the Civil War and the Reconstruction era that ended in 1877. And so these legal systems of segregation, what we saw in the South being called or largely construed as Jim Crow. In the North, you often had restrictive covenants, restrictive access points that kept black folks and Latinx folks from accessing certain kinds of public accommodations or living in certain places. What these things did was ultimately maintain a separate but equal space. The idea was that these are separate areas for people of color to be away from white folks. And so this was applied to a number of different kinds of endeavors, really how we lived our lives. And so really, with this legal segregation, it really relegated white folks to their own culture and people of color to their own culture. So with respect to parks, recreational facilities, housing, neighborhoods, how we use public accommodations, those were largely segregated, with the most segregated